In the middle of the 14th century, people went to bed healthy and woke up dying. A fever would strike without warning. Dark swellings appeared under the arms and along the neck. Within days, sometimes hours, entire families were gone. Church bells rang so often that cities stopped counting the dead. Graveyards overflowed, streets fell silent, and across Europe, a single terrifying question echoed everywhere. Was this the end of the world? What people didn't realize at the time was that they were witnessing the deadliest pandemic in recorded human history, one that would kill up to half of Europe's population and permanently reshape civilization itself. This was the Black Death, and once it began, there was no escape. To understand the devastation that followed, we must first understand the height from which humanity fell. The early 14th century was not a time of darkness and stagnation, as often portrayed. It was the apex of the High Middle Ages, a period of remarkable stability, population explosion, and interconnectedness that Europe had not seen since the Roman Empire. Thanks to a climatic phenomenon known as the medieval warm period, harvests had been bountiful for generations. The population of Europe had nearly doubled in 2 centuries. Cities were bursting past their ancient Roman walls. Paris, Florence, Venice, and London were vibrant, chaotic, densely packed hives of human activity. The Gothic cathedrals were rising, symbols of a society that felt closer to God and more technologically capable than their ancestors. More importantly, the world was connected. A merchant in Venice could buy silk that traveled the entire length of Asia without ever leaving trade networks secured by the Mongol Empire, the Pax Mongolica. This vast network, the medieval World Wide Web, moved spices, gold, ideas, and technology across continents with unprecedented speed. It was a glorious, bustling, optimistic world. But this interconnectedness was a double-edged sword. The same caravans and ships that brought wealth were about to deliver the greatest catastrophe in human history. The infrastructure for global disaster was perfectly laid out. This society, seemingly so robust, was about to face an enemy it could not see, could not understand, and could not fight. The origin of the apocalypse lay thousands of miles from the stone streets of Paris, in the vast, windswept steppes of Central Asia, likely in the region of modern-day Kyrgyzstan or northern China. This is a landscape of extremes, endless horizons of grassland, harsh winters, and blistering summers. Here, an ancient biological agent had existed for millennia, Yersinia pestis. It is a bacterium of ruthless efficiency, endemic to the burrowing rodent populations of the steppes, marmots and ground squirrels. For centuries, the bacterium lived in a relatively stable ecological balance with its hosts, far from major human population centers. But in the 1330s, the delicate balance of the steppes was disrupted. Climate historians point to a period of ecological stress, perhaps a severe drought followed by heavy rains, that devastated the rodent population's food sources. Driven by hunger, the infected rodents migrated closer to human settlements, bringing their fleas with them. The leap from animal to human occurred in the trading outposts along the Silk Road. The first human victims likely didn't understand what was happening. They developed high fevers, vomiting, and the terrifying, painful swellings in their lymph nodes, the buboes, that gave the disease its name. News in the ancient world traveled slowly, but rumors of disaster traveled faster than merchant caravans. By the early 1340s, terrifying, fragmented reports began reaching Mediterranean ports. Merchants spoke of entire civilizations in the east vanishing, of reigns of fire and pestilence that left India, Tartary, and Mesopotamia depopulated. The Europeans listened to these tales with a mix of horror and detachment, viewing them as distant tragedies in exotic lands, perhaps divine retribution for foreign beliefs. They had no concept of germ theory. They didn't realize that the spices peppering their food were traveling the same road as their eventual executioner. The geographical pivot point of this history is the Crimean Peninsula, jutting into the northern Black Sea. Here sat the magnificent city of Caffa. Caffa was not merely a town, it was a fortified, incredibly wealthy colony of the Republic of Genoa. It was the crucial hinge connecting the overland Asian routes to the maritime Mediterranean networks. Inside its massive stone walls lived Italian merchants, Armenian traders, and a cosmopolitan mix of peoples protected by Genoese crossbowmen. In 1346, Caffa was under siege. The mighty army of the Golden Horde, a successor state of the Mongol Empire led by Khan Jani Beg, surrounded the city. The Genoese were masters of defense and maritime resupply, and the siege dragged on for months in a brutal stalemate. But then a silent killer began to stalk the Mongol camps. The besieging army, living in close quarters with poor sanitation, became the perfect breeding ground for the bacterium that had traveled with them from the east. Soldiers began dying by the hundreds, then thousands, their bodies turning dark with gangrene before death. The Mongol army was dissolving not from enemy action, but from biology. Witnessing his army disintegrate and facing defeat, Jani Beg made a horrific decision that would change the course of history. In an act of desperate, calculated psychological and biological warfare, he ordered the corpses of his plague-ridden soldiers to be loaded onto trebuchets. For days, the sky over Caffa rained dead bodies. The Genoese defenders watched in horror as the pestilent corpses smashed onto roofs and into market squares. The psychological terror was immense, but the biological impact was immediate. The bacteria, carried by the fluids of the corpses and the fleas abandoning their cold hosts for warm living ones, infiltrated the city. The unbreakable fortress had been breached from within. Panic gripped Caffa. The wealthy Genoese merchants, realizing the city was doomed, utilized their greatest asset, their ships. 12 Genoese galleys loaded with refugees, cargo, and unseen stowaways slipped out of the harbor, fleeing past the dying Mongol army, heading for the safety of home. They sailed through the Bosphorus past Constantinople, which was soon devastated itself, and into the open Mediterranean. This sea was the economic engine of Europe, a zone of intense, fast-moving trade. The fleeing ships became vectors of death, docking at major hubs to resupply, unknowingly seeding the infection at every stop. The first major European port to fall was Messina in Sicily. When the Genoese galleys arrived, the dock workers who rowed out to meet them were greeted by a scene from hell. Contemporary chroniclers record that most sailors were dead, their bodies rotting on deck. The few survivors were delirious, racked with pain, covered in black boils dripping blood and pus. The port authorities of Messina realized too late the nature of the cargo. They ordered the ships expelled, but the true agents of transmission, the black rats ubiquitous on medieval ships and the fleas on their backs, had already used the mooring ropes to scurry onto the docks. Messina was the test case for Europe, and it failed miserably. The speed of the infection was paralyzing. The close-quartered living conditions of a medieval port city acted as an accelerant. Within weeks, the social fabric of Messina disintegrated. People fled the city for the countryside, only spreading the contagion further across the island. News of the great pestilence spread, and other ports tried to close their harbors to ships from the east. But medieval quarantine was a leaky sieve. Greed often overcame caution. A ship laden with valuable spices could often bribe its way into port. By early 1348, The great maritime republics were crumbling. Genoa, the home port of the ships from Caffa, was devastated. Venice, the queen of the Adriatic, faced an existential threat. The Venetians, the most pragmatic of merchants, eventually developed the concept of the lazaretto, islands in the lagoon designated as quarantine zones, where arriving ships and crews had to wait 40 days, 40 giorni, before entering the city. It was a pioneering public health measure, but for the first wave, it was too little, too late. The gondolas of Venice became funeral barges, piling bodies high as they navigated the silent canals. From the Italian ports, the disease moved west to Marseille, the great gateway to France, and crossed the Adriatic to Dubrovnik. The coastal perimeter of Europe was breached. Now the disease turned inland. As the plague moved away from the coasts, following river barges along the Rhone and carts along Roman roads, it encountered the dense heart of medieval Europe. Cities like Paris, Florence, London, and Barcelona were walled enclosures of winding, narrow alleys, multi-story timber houses that blocked out the sun, and open sewers running down the center of streets. They were incredibly vibrant, rich places, but hygienically, they were tinderboxes waiting for a spark. When the plague hit a major metropolis, it didn't just kill people, it killed the city itself as a functioning organism. We must understand the terror of facing this without modern science. The best minds of the 14th century, the doctors of the University of Paris, were baffled. Their framework was not germ theory, but the ancient Greek theory of humours and miasma. They believed the air itself had been corrupted, perhaps by a specific planetary alignment of Saturn, Jupiter and Mars in 1345 that released noxious vapours from the Earth. Doctors advised people not to bathe, as it opened the pores to corrupted air. They burned aromatic woods like juniper and rosemary in street corners to combat the smell of